Hello, welcome everybody. Week 7. There's only 2 weeks left in the course, so we're almost there. We're gonna have two lectures this week, and then I believe we only have three more lectures remaining until your final. So very exciting stuff. You guys almost made it through. Um, Today we're talking about fiscal policy. General information, there's two reading quizzes that are due on Sunday. Also, I'm gonna remind you guys kind of early that there's the writing assignment two, number two, is up. It is due the Friday after, or 2 days after you take your final. So if you want to be done with this class as soon as possible, get that writing assignment in so you don't have to worry about it past the final. All right. So when we're talking about fiscal policy will start in general. This means it's government spent money on goods and services for the country. So like in our big ol' equation for GDP, we had this G here. We've talked about the planned expenditure and all of that. And we kind of said G is zero and taxes are zero. Now we're going to kind of change that assumption. We're going to see the government's role. We're going to start with what's called the gap recap. So the economy is self-correcting when shocks to aggregate demand affect aggregate output in the short run, but not the long run. We saw this with the long run aggregate supply model, meaning the economy will eventually return to its potential output. This happens when nominal wages adjust. So during a boom, they will rise, shift the aggregate supply in, and then during a recession, it will fall, shifting the aggregate supply out. Very nice. This is kind of a little bit of review from last lecture. Um, so it says if there is a recession, just relax, it will go away. In the theory, this is what it says. In practice, this is not the probably best approach for a politician to take. Okay. So in whatever the long run is called, uh, the long run, everything's going to be okay. That's what the last slide just said. There's a very famous economist named Keynes that said this quote, and I believe this was during the Great Depression. He said, "In the long run, we are all dead." So he's like, yeah, it's great that we're going to return to our potential output eventually, but we don't know how long this long run is going to take to, for their example, for like the wages to drop and the economy to self-correct. So he's like, this is great, but we need to do something in the short run because if we just let the economy naturally heal itself, it's going to take too long and we're not going to be better off as a nation. Okay, so from that we got stabilization policy, which is the use of the government policy to reduce the severity of recessions, rein in excessively strong expansions. Today we're talking about fiscal policy. This is government making policy. And then I'm sure you guys are familiar with what the central bank is, the Fed. They do monetary policy. And we'll talk about that in the future. We're not quite there yet. But I guess the current dynamics, Jerome Powell, who's kind of been in the news lately, he's in charge of the Fed, and the Fed controls monetary policy. So a big thing that they do is change the interest rate. And then fiscal policy is all the stuff that politicians pass in Congress when regarding to taxes and government spending and government debt and all the above. So if we have expansionary fiscal policy. It's going to do what the name kind of suggests. This is going to increase the aggregate demand. An example of this would be like an infrastructure bill that's going to give a lot of jobs in a certain area, and it's going to make that economy kind of boom because of all these jobs and more money flowed to them. Contractionary fiscal policy is going to reduce the aggregate demand. So this is just like increasing taxes is a great one. If we unanimously increase taxes, then it's going to make people have less money in their pocket, so they're going to spend less, and this is going to kind of cool down our economy. Very nice. Okay, so a cut in taxes is the opposite of a raise in taxes, so that would be expansionary. Increase in the government purchases of goods and services is also expansionary, and then an increase in government transfer is also pretty much when the government tries to put money, give money to you or put money closely around you, that's considered expansionary. And how this works is, well, it's just quite simply going to shift up the aggregate demand, right? So say we are in the 2008 recession right here at E1, and if the government did not do anything, wages would adjust over time and we would be okay. Um, but we don't know how long it would take to get back to YP, all right? It could take a very long time. So instead, what they did is they had expansionary fiscal policy along with monetary policy, and it moved the aggregate demand back to our our long run point. Okay, so contractionary, increase in taxes, reduction in government purchases, and a reduction in government transfer. Like examples of this for specifically like these government transfers, this usually encompasses like unemployment benefits, or we had the COVID checks for unemployment, so those would get taken away. That's an example of contractionary fiscal policy. What happens here is you take less money away from the economy, and so that's going to decrease aggregate demand, so it can help cool off an economy. Now, some of these things may be better to do at certain times when you have a hot economy. Um, and an increase in taxes, I'll say we are assuming in our model that everybody has the same amount of income, which is not the case in the United States, obviously, because we have Bezos living here along with a couple other billionaires. So when we say increases in taxes, we're increasing everybody's um, rate of their paycheck, and we assume that their paychecks are all the same. That's kind of how these models work. They're actually, this is a bit of a tangent, but it's kind of important to understand. Um, all of these models are inherently what we call representative agent models. So we assume that there is one person, and then we multiply that person by the entire population, and that gives us our country for our model. Okay. So in the dynamics of, today where we do not have this. There's a couple models that will do this, but they're a bit too complicated. So we're kind of going to stick with the basics, the basic representative agent model here. Okay, automatic stabilizers. So government spending and taxation rules that cause fiscal policy to be automatically expansionary when the economy contracts and automatically contractionary when the economy expands. Okay, so in contrast, discretionary fiscal policy arises from deliberate actions by policymakers rather than from the business cycle. Okay, we'll wait on automatic stabilizers. I think we have another slide on this. Discretionary fiscal policy is kind of my philosophy for how fiscal policy works. It's kind of the policymakers are always trying to do the same thing, regardless of how we're doing as a country, economically. They don't really like to say, okay, well, actually, things are really good right now, so now I want to raise taxes. That's not something like politicians brag about at all. So even in the good and bad times, they kind of push for the same thing. This is why it's very nice that we have monetary policy because they can kind of do the heavy lifting if they need to. For automatic stabilizers, though, we have the spending that occurs automatically when there is a recession. So you have unemployment insurance, progressive taxation. So the very rich people who have kept their job, they're going to have to pay a higher share. Income redistribution. So it doesn't require as much time to get implemented as discretionary fiscal policy. These are kind of things that just happen during recession. During recession, you have more people who are unemployed, so they're taking the unemployment checks, etc. Persistent deficits have long-run consequences because they lead to an increase in public debt. The United States is very much in debt, um, and it's fine, it's okay. Um, but there's a lot of politicians who will say that they want to get out of debt, we have to decrease the debt, and then they'll go and pass things that increase the debt. So it's a pretty common thing. I think what's more important economically is that you're not increasing the debt drastically, and that a small increase in the debt is going to be okay. Okay, so what is a deficit versus a debt? The deficit is the difference between the amount of money a government spends and it receives on taxes over a given period. So the debt is the total sum of money a government owes at a particular point in time. Okay, so kind of very similar. But when we talk about a government deficit, this is just saying I collect all these taxes from you guys, and then I spend more money than I collect. When we talk about debt, it's more how much I owe to specific parties. Maybe it's through treasury bonds, maybe it's through foreign capital owners or something like that. So it's a little bit of a difference. Again, these are kind of like keywords for a lot of politicians is we want to decrease the deficit, all that. So it's kind of good to we'll see how these play a role. So deficit and debt are linked because obviously the government debt grows when the government runs a deficit. If I cannot pay for all the healthcare that I want to provide to America, then I have to borrow it from someone, so that puts me in debt. But they aren't the same thing. They can tell different types of stories. So, for example, at the end of the fiscal 2008, US debt as a percentage of GDP was low, but the deficit during the 2008 was considerably quite high. Why it was high is because we were trying to get ourselves out of this Wall Street recession that occurred. And so we had to spend a lot of money to help us get out of this. And so we had a high deficit. But when we looked at the debt as a percentage of the GDP, it was fairly low, which means that we are very comfortable paying off this debt. We know that over time we can definitely pay off this debt. Okay, so when when we have rising government debt, we kind of talked about this a bit, but then public debt is going to crowd out investment spending. So this is going to reduce long-run economic growth. Yeah, we saw this in the market for loanable funds before the midterm, where we saw that when the government was a big borrower, this increased the interest rate, which means that more businesses didn't want to sign up for loans for, say, a new factory because now the interest rate was too high. In extreme cases, rising debt may lead to a government default, resulting in economic and financial turmoil. Um, I'm trying to think when this happened. I'm pretty sure it happened in Argentina. It's never happened in the United States. Um, Usually we try to avoid this because this leads to not great things. So can a government that has trouble borrowing just print money to pay its bills? That's a classic argument. If you're coming into econ, if you've never taken an econ class, you might think this is a great idea. If you don't know what inflation is, this might be fantastic. Um, So the answer is it definitely can, right? If I owe you $10, I have the ability to print a $10 bill. I can just print a $10 bill and give it to you. But the problem here is when I put more money into the system, so when there's more $10 bills in the system, each $10 bill uh, doesn't go as far, right? So it leads to an inflation problem where I print a bunch of $10 bills, and now this pen that was worth $10 is worth $30 because there's just so much money in the system that all the money doesn't really give as much buying power to certain things. So printing money is not the solution to get out of debt. All right, so we got a little COVID graph here because COVID really screwed everything up for everything here. So it's kind of just fun to look at COVID. We have federal spending and revenue. So you see during COVID, we had a lot of federal spending. This is a good thing. We need to roll out the vaccines. That was pretty costly. We also needed to give people stimulus checks, which was good for the economy, um, bad for federal spending because it increased a lot. And then we look at federal revenue. So federal revenue, it usually find this case where federal revenue is less than spending. We did have this one golden era, I guess you could say. I think this was Clinton was the last time we had a surplus, meaning we took in more money than we spent. Um, and then right here, you see this is a 2008 recession. So during recessions, we have to spend a lot of money. It's just how it goes because we need to help out our people. We don't want to wait till the long run because, as Keen said, in the long run, we're all dead. Okay. And then this is more of a projection. So I'm not sure when the data actually stops, but I do know we just did pass a bill by Republicans, and typically Republicans are the ones who are trying to decrease the federal spending because they're always worried about the deficit, but their bill increased the deficit by quite a bit. So there's that. Um, on the right, we have a century of government spending, federal outlays as a percent of GDP. So the big spike right here, this was World War II. Okay, we had to spend a lot of money there, rightfully so. Okay, and then the non-defense has kind of steadily increased. Again, you can kind of see where a recession is. Here's 2008, and then here's COVID. So this kind of makes sense when there are big recessions. There's more of an incentive for Congress or the president or whoever has the power to do fiscal policy to pump a lot of money into the system because it's going to help us recover faster. So the problem deficits and debt cause are mostly long run problems. The recessionary gap is a short run problem. Okay. What what's long and what's short run? There's no really time length for it. For long run, it could be 10, 20, 30 years. For short run, that's usually just not the long run, is kind of how we model it. So the Keynesian advice here is to run a deficit during recession. This will stimulate the aggregate demand. This will get us back on track faster. This is what you see. And then during the good times, we should pay down the debt. You don't really see this last part. Typically, we just always try to keep the economy hot. But we sometimes do have to realize that when we're in good times, we need to cool off the economy a bit. This is why, the Fed increased the interest rate a couple times. They were also kind of fighting inflation. We had some weird stuff going on in the last couple years for sure. Okay, so let's get into our model. Okay, so this is the model that we've talked with the Keynesian cross. Now we're going to add government and trade. So we have our Y equals C plus I plus G plus net exports. This is the same thing from GDP. We've had this for a long time. We know that in equilibrium, our output is going to equal uh, our consumption equation, which is a function of disposable income, which is YD. So disposable income, I guess, is the income that's left after taxes. So that's what you see. It's Y minus T. Okay. We multiply that by the MPC, and then we have A, which is like the things that you need to purchase, like food. This is all from, remember, last lecture, the lecture before. Okay, and then we have our investment that's planned. And now we had government and net exports. When we were originally doing this Keynesian cross, it was introduced. We said these were both zero. Now we're talking about the government, so we're going to add these back in. Okay. Um, so notice how the consumption is now going to depend on taxes. If I have very high taxes, this means I can't consume as much. So the government affects the aggregate expenditures through government spending and taxes. Okay, increased taxes decreases aggregate expenditure, increased government spending increases this as well. Okay. Um, so here's our consumption equation. Here's our aggregate ex uh, planned expenditure equation. And then all we're doing up to get to this top one is we're just adding this government plus net exports. And then I guess we're also adding the taxes. In this case, these are expansionary because it's increasing the aggregate planned aggregate expenditure. Okay, so we can just look at this equation, come to some conclusions. So what is cutting taxes going to do? Well, cutting taxes means that this T goes down, which means that this consumption function should go up. So then we would see that aggregate expenditures should go up. And this is fiscal policy. The other one that we're going to look at is when government spending goes up, obviously aggregate expenditure is going to go up to balance out this equation. So this would also be expansionary fiscal policy. All right, counter-cyclical policy. Remember, this is all welfare enhancing, so bringing resources into use increases output, protect people from negative consequences of unemployment, improve consumption smoothing due to smoother income, but it's not easy. Must see shocks coming and react appropriately. Very nice. Let's just move on. Okay, so we simplified, like I said, we had our model that was just C plus I, and then in our equilibrium, we had this equation, and we know that Y is a function of consumption. So from that, we could get Y star. Now we're just going to add government and I guess net exports, except I think we'll make this zero. And then there are taxes. Taxes are in the form that this consumption is a function of how much income we have as well as how much we're getting taxed. So the question now is, how do we solve? Well, we have a very nice equation here, a very nice example that we're going to go through at the end. This will kind of give you an idea of what's going on here. Okay, so here's it all laid out. We have consumption, investment plan, government spending, we have taxes, and then we have our net exports, which we're making zero, which is great. Okay, so we know from our equation, we have something like this, right? And net exports is zero, so I'm just going to leave it as zero. Okay, so we know that consumption, the I'm just plugging in the formula that they give me, which is right here. Okay, and then investment planned is 50, and then our government spending is 60. Okay, and they even give us the taxes are 60. So I'm just going to write this minus taxes are 60 plus 50 plus 60. Okay, and as you can see at this point, we have an equation where the only variable is y, so we can just simplify this equation and solve for y. I believe this is done on the next. It is done on the next slide. So on the next slide, you can see when we simplify this equation, and again, we're solving for this y right here. That will be our y star. Um, we can do this, and then we get y star equals 300. So very nice. It's awesome. Okay, so now what if 300 is too small, which is our y star? What if we want y star to be bigger? What can we do? We can increase the government spending from 60 to 85. So remember, this was 60 before, now it's 85. We do a whole bunch of algebra, and now we get our y star equals 400. So an increase in spending of 25 leads to a rise in output of 100. Uh, what does that sound like? It means we have the spending multiplier. Remember the spending multiplier that we talked about with the MPC, and then there's the multiplier, and there's some equations that we had to know. Um, well, the same thing kind of works here. So we have the change. Remember these deltas, these, I guess they're triangles. These are deltas. Um, this means change. Okay. So the change in Y equals the change in government spending times the spending multiplier. Um, Through our equation right here, we can just figure it out. There's a different type of question that I could ask you possibly where we go back to here. Say we want Y star to be 400, and I say, like, what level of G gets us here? So in this case, we'd be looking for Y star to be 400, and then we are just going to copy all of this. Well, this is 400 minus 60 plus 50 plus G. You solve for G in this equation, and then you should get G equals 85, right? As we have kind of found right here. Okay. So yeah, just get comfortable with this equation, kind of know how government is going to act in this case. Um, and then know that there is like this spending multiplier that's happening here. So just because I increase government spending by 10 bucks doesn't mean the output will increase by $10. So let's look at a different case where we have G is at our 60, which was the old level, but now our taxes are going to fall to 35. What happens is you get a Y star increase up to 375, so it's less effective. Why is it less effective? The issue is when giving out a tax cut, people don't spend it all, they save, whereas when the government spends money, it is all spent. Okay, so when the government decides to have some fiscal policy, they are just going to take a lump sum of money and then they are going to just put it into the economy. Okay, when the government does a tax cut, essentially they're taking that big uh, lump of money and they're not just spending it, they're just accepting that we won't have this in tax revenue. But now all the people have all this money, and what they do instead is they'll save it. They're not going to spend all of their tax cut, right? So, for example, if taxes fell for me, and I go from making 10 bucks an hour to now with the tax cut, I make 12 bucks an hour. That doesn't mean that I'm just going to spend that $2 of tax cuts right away. Like I'm probably going to put it in the savings. I'll probably spend some, but not all of that, right? So we do have a multiplier on a tax cut. It's so like I said, it's only a fraction of the dollar that's spent. So we get this equation right here. Okay, it's negative because an increase in taxes decreases spending, right? This makes sense. If we increase taxes, I have less money to spend. So this makes sense that the tax multiplier should be negative. Since the multiplier on tax cuts is smaller than the multiplier on spending, government spending is more effective at moving aggregate demand than a tax cut. Okay, very nice. So usually when we're talking about things we want to finance as a country, we talk about increasing taxes or decreasing taxes? Well, it's important to note that when we increase a tax, even if it's we all make the same amount of money, it's not going to hurt us as much as just taking away a service that costs the same amount that the government's going to gain from the tax cut. Yeah, nice. So spending increases output, raising taxes reduces output. This should make sense to you guys, right? We have a balanced budget multiplier, which is the spending multiplier plus the tax multiplier has to equal 1. This is just like a math identity we get. So when the government spending increases output while raising the taxes necessary to finance the spending decreases output, so taxes are going to offset the spending gains. It's very hard to fight a recession and balance the budget at the same time. This is why you see during the recessions like 2020 and 2008, we had a big jump in government spending and then taxes didn't follow suit, right? So, widely used measure of fiscal health is the debt to GDP ratio. Our GDP is what we have to pay off the debt, so that's what we should compare it to. This number can remain stable or fall or even face some moderate budget deficits if GDP rises over time. So yeah, when we're talking about when all the politicians talk about the deficit, um, they talk about the deficit and it's a really big number and it's ever growing and it's blah blah blah. But what's important more is the debt to GDP ratio, which is tells us can we afford to take more money? If the debt to GDP ratio is very low, this means that I'm not taking a whole lot of money out to do something good for my country when I know that I can repay it. If the debt to GDP ratio is really high, this means I probably shouldn't do this because I am going to put myself in a position where I could potentially default. And if a country defaults, that's very bad economically for that country. Okay, so this was fiscal policy, first lecture of week 7. We have a couple more lectures and then we're at the end of the class already. This class has flown by. So I will see you guys for the next lecture. Thanks.